Had a conversation a couple of nights ago over dinner with some friends, and we were talking about what had been happening over the past couple of years. You know, we're lamenting about lockdowns and the performance of government, the economy, the cost of living crisis, the BBC even, and or legacy media as some people call it. And it got me thinking about what had changed over the last couple of years, and more specifically what's changed for me. So I thought I'd come for a bit of a walk today through the park, bring the GoPro along, just have a think as I'm walking, maybe capture a few thoughts along the way. So welcome to the video. It's not my music appreciation style today, or talking about cycling. Just me reflecting on where we are in November 2022. I think I'll start by talking about some personal or professional stuff about myself. When the lockdown came along, it was pretty evident that I was going to find it trickier to find new clients and certainly travel to deliver training or do consulting work. So I could see that my income was going to kind of move from fairly stable and predictable to something that was a lot less so. So I decided that to cash in, as it were, a couple of my company pensions from my earlier years, and begin to embrace semi-retirement. So I started out thinking about retirement and what it would mean, and it wasn't too long really after the lockdowns were kicked in that I decided that that was the way it was going to go. Now, I had a bike accident as well that put the kind of was the icing on the cake. It's kind of where I began to realize that life was changing. So I was talking to a number of people who had already kind of retired, which they were talking about the third age, and I thought what would happen was I would begin to enjoy the retirement years almost as if I was on holiday. So you know when you're on holiday and you're not watching the clock, and you kind of just, every day is like Sunday, and I thought that's the way it was going to be. But one of the things I've learned, that the administration that goes with being in work doesn't quite dry up when you retire or start on that particular journey. So I found myself sitting at my desk most days for some period of time and carrying on as normal. So yeah, the idea that retirement is like being on holiday, it's not really the case. Hasn't been the case for me. So yeah, that's something I didn't know 2 years ago. But that's kind of a less serious issue really. It's just like, I'm just like everyone else, just has to adjust to a kind of a new routine, and it'll eventually kick in. But anyway, on to more serious matters. What's been the big change over the past 2 years, 2.5 years? Well, it's been the pandemic, and I got to talk about the pandemic. Now, I talked about this on and off ever since the lockdown started. And I was doing kind of a bit of a video diary about what it felt like right at the very beginning, when we were all really seriously concerned, frightened even, about what was happening. So yeah, incredibly difficult time. But things settled down fairly quickly. Once we knew that by kind of May 2020 that the people who were most vulnerable from the coronavirus were the aged and infirm people suffering from long-term heart disease or diabetes or cancer, and they ended their days, instead of dying of pneumonia, kind of finishing them off, they were dying with a positive test for the old virus. So the pandemic is the backdrop to just about everything I'm going to talk about now. So I'm going to start with the government response. Now, this is a whole video on its own, of course, but of course, as we remember, the governments were panicked, seemingly panicked, and were convinced that the transmission of a virus could be curtailed, constrained by lockdowns. Keep people away from each other to a large extent, and hope that the virus was to mutate sufficiently to become less virulent by the time that everybody then catches it. Now, you know, I've caught it in 2022. Doctors thought I may have caught it in early 2022, but early 2020. But that's that'll never be confirmed, because there weren't any tests available at that particular point. So anyway, we've all had it, pretty much. We've all had it, whether we've had the jab or not, how many jabs we've had or not. But the government had its policies. What's really strange, what I learned, is that the government had access to scientific knowledge that it wasn't prepared to share with the country. It knew that lockdowns weren't really working, and that's been proven by a number of studies of what's been happening around the world. There's been, you know, lockdowns and mask mandates and things like that. Didn't move the needle at all when it came to the prevalence of the virus in any particular country, or the number of people who contracted the virus, or who developed an immune response to the virus, shall we say. So the government didn't really tell us the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Far from it. Now, some friends of mine who put the government response down to fear and incompetence, and although I might accept that up to a certain degree, I read the book by Laura Dodsworth called The State of Fear, or A State of Fear, that was published in 2021, which has analysis and whistleblowers and other commentators, experts in the field, who put a very, very compelling case that the government deliberately used nudge tactics and persuasion, or propaganda as some might call it, to frighten the population into compliance with its intentions. So it's no accident that the government had a pandemic response that was consistent across almost all Western nations and beyond, that were really suppressing the normal routines of people and what they were allowed and not allowed to do. But let's not just dwell on the virus. I may come back to it. governments ended up putting in their equivalent of the UK's furlough scheme, which was ostensibly to stop the complete collapse of the economy and the loss of jobs and businesses. Wanted to keep people in employment, so when the worst had passed, people could begin to operate more normally again, and the economy could kind of pick up where it left off, and maybe with a bit of catch up from kind of what was in effect a recession. So the economic consequences of that are being experienced right now. Now, governments will have you believe that it's all down in the UK to Liz Truss's mini budget, or they'll talk about the war in southeastern Europe as the reason for why we have inflation, that why we have energy costs going through the roof, and a genuine energy crisis in Europe and the Americas, North America. But I think that the source of the financial problem is twofold, really. One, it's the ongoing quantitative easing and printing of money, effectively. That's been going on since 2008. That was never intended to go on so long, and of course accelerated during the lockdowns, the pandemic lockdowns, and the introduction of the furlough scheme. And that's effectively fueled inflation, more and more money in the system, chasing fewer and fewer goods and services, and so inflation is inevitable. So we're facing a really incredibly difficult winter coming up, and who knows how people are going to cope. The government's giving a little bit of money to various to most households, I believe, to ease some of the pain, and it's made some other interventions in the energy market, but people have short memories, and so they don't realise that the source of this is much deeper and goes back much longer. But anyway, the bottom line is that during the lockdowns and the pandemic, we began to see our public services stripped back to the very basics. So things like the passport office, or the driving license, the DVLA in the UK, driving license authorities, the health service, the legal system, and so on and so forth. And all of these, shall we say, institutions have all failed us, and failed us to a catastrophic level where I think we're being inadvertently or deliberately being conditioned to expect much better quality services going forward. So we have to be more and more self-sufficient if we want to look after ourselves and our families. So the bottom line is that I have reached a point where, as a traditionally floating voter, voted for every major party in the UK in elections since 1979. I have given up. I don't trust our politicians. I don't trust the systems which they're overseeing. It's hard to say. Well, it's hard to say whether we live in a genuinely democratic country anymore, and that's just not a UK phenomenon. It's something that happens way beyond Western democracies. Big question marks are being asked. So, what has that done to me in 2 years? I think it's made me far more cynical. And cynical, but so cynical is kind of, it's a bad thing, really, I guess, but I'm also skeptical. It's made me a lot more skeptical of just taking on face value that which I'm told by people in authority. So it's an unhappier place, it's a less trusting place, and I think the consequences of that are mass voter apathy and an ever widening disconnect, void between the electorate and those who sit in power. So I think our MPs are going to be far more remote going forward than they have been. I've always been suspicious of authority. Now, I don't know why. Well, I do know why. No, I don't know why. But let me tell you my first memory, my first recollection of where authority really pissed me off. I was, for a time when I was a young teenager, I joined the Boy Scouts. I've been in the Cubs and enjoyed it, doing lots of kind of young adventure stuff under the leadership of people who were a bit older. And then I went to the Scouts, and I was astonished within the first 2 weeks of how regimented it was. Standing in line, not quite saluting, but certainly not taking instructions from people who are a bit older, but taking directions and commands. And I thought, I'm not having any of this. If I was 13 years old, I don't see why I should be respecting someone who's 15, kind of trying to boss me around. Anyway, so I didn't last long in the Scouts. And people might have some opinions about that. Maybe it's my fault, but didn't like authority then, and I don't like authority now. And when it comes to my working life and my adult life, I've kind of maintained that suspicion of authority. I've kind of looked towards competence, people who really know what they're doing, and anyone who's kind of lorded it over me or anyone else in the name of status and authority has got my hackles up. And let me tell you, and I'll admit something, when I had my first management role, I behaved just as badly. So maybe it goes with the role. Bottom line is that once you give somebody a little bit of power, don't be surprised when they exercise that power in ways that are not necessarily benevolent. And I guess that brings me back to the government again. But anyway, I won't go there anymore at this point. Let's talk instead about other people's reaction to authority. When we were talking over dinner, it was evident that the level of suspicion or skepticism about what people have been told was really quite low amongst some of my friends. So I might be skeptical, but that skepticism is not shared by people. People are, in some cases, extremely trusting. And this notion, to come back to the government for a minute, this notion that the government is there or can be trusted to perform their roles in a way that it's for the good of society, with the odd aberration about good for themselves as well, but generally speaking, good people go into politics. People really still believe that, and I don't. And maybe it's my fault. Maybe they've got it right and I've got it wrong. But I don't think so. People have become incredibly trusting, or maintain that level of trust. So when the government says, thou shalt wear masks, thou shalt stay at home, thou shalt take a medical procedure, people are kind of not aware and think, well, the government knows best. And you know, for that, and I say government, I also mean in the case of the pandemic, medical authorities know best. But anyone who's been, just to come back to the pandemic, and forgive me if this goes a bit back and forward, is that one of the things I've been doing over the last couple of years is spending a huge amount of time studying what people are saying, writing and broadcasting about what's happened and what the emerging science is telling everyone. I say everyone who looks. And I'm reminded of something I heard a long time ago, is that, you know, the world looks very different under a microscope. And of course it does. And you know, in my professional career, I used to be primarily a procurement practitioner and expert, as it were. And you know, procurement, well, what's that? Well, it's buying in it. Well, the professional magazine that represented and provided insight to my profession, it's called Supply Management, and I used to read it every 2 weeks. I used to be an occasional contributor, and if that's all you ever read, that's all you would ever understand about procurement. But through a microscope, you look deeper, and it's a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced than that. And so, I guess the analogy I'm referring to is that if you look deep enough and spend enough time studying a particular subject area, how you see the world, how you understand it, is very, very different from people who take their guidance from people who are in authority. Now, I don't want to get too highfalutin, because people say, well, that's critical thinking and people don't think critically enough. Well, I do kind of agree with that. I think critical thinking is something that's not as well practiced as I thought it was 2 years ago. Yeah, I thought people would make their own decisions. I thought they would look at the evidence, they'd have a really good think about it, they would kind of triangulate from various sources to try and kind of decipher complex problems and make informed decisions. But, you know, I'm in my early 60s now, and I don't know whether I spent most of my life being naive. But I'm wrong. If that's what I've felt all those years, I'm evidently wrong. Because people are incredibly trusting. And when you say to someone who's taken a 4th medical intervention, still gets ill, still, you know, kind of accepts that it doesn't stop you getting ill or stop onward transmission. Yeah, there's only so much you can say, really. And you don't have to be a medical expert to kind of work out that something hasn't been quite right for the past 2 years or so. So maybe I'll say no more about that. I'm walking along here in new boots. Bloody hell. Wearing the wrong socks. I think I'm gonna have blood on my heels by the time I finish this walk. Not good. So what have I talked about? Talked about government, I've talked about the pandemic. Talk about friends. I think, as I say, the pandemic is the backdrop to all of this. But friendships have been really under strain, haven't they? And I think I've said this before, but it's really quite distressing. It's too strong a point, because you roll with it, really. You know, some friendships, they ebb and flow. Sometimes they're gone for good, sometimes they are gone for a while. But one of the things that I've noticed is that people are a lot more careful about what they talk about. I think people have made decisions over the past couple of years that they need to maintain a consistency about those decisions, because otherwise they would suffer what's called cognitive dissonance. So if you made a series of decisions in one particular direction, and then the evidence comes along that suggests that that's not necessarily the wisest thing you would do, most people continue to hold on to those and reject the new evidence because it causes too much dissonance in their thought processes, and in some cases, really challenges people's view of themselves and how competent they are as citizens. So anyway, people are a lot more circumspect about what they bring up in conversation, and I think that's contributed to an erosion of trust between people. Now, I know people have made their own decisions, but there's been so much controversy around some of those decisions, that people they just don't want to talk about it. So, when I think about some of the friends that I have, there's a very small number I'm able to have perhaps a deeper conversation with, and there's others I do, good people, but I kind of do activities with them, so I cycle or I golf or whatever it is, and I'm surrounded by good people, and generally pretty smart people too, and certainly well-educated people, and so it's not really a criticism of people. It's more of kind of a reflection on the number of people who I can honestly say conversations with them are nothing is off limits. The number of people who that involves now is incredibly small. I don't really want to think about how small that might be, but there's a lot of kind of affable relationships and cooperative relationships around, but that deeper level of trust it's just not the same 2 years on. It's just not the same. It's also worth saying that some people are very comfortable with where they are, and they've managed to compartmentalize their life, seemingly compartmentalize their life to such an extent that they've put the contradictions and the difficulties of a pandemic behind them. So they're getting on with life as normal. So credit to them. It's just not me though. I spent in my career, 30 odd years being sold to, negotiating, and teaching salespeople and teaching procurement people how to, really improve their competence and in these specialist areas. So it's just in my nature that I'm kind of quite forensic, really, and skeptical about what people are saying to me, because I know how people bend the truth, because I've done it myself. And you will in negotiations. So when you you know, when you kind of think, well, is it me and everybody else is okay? I think you have to acknowledge that we're all made different. Our experiences bring different things to us, got different strengths and weaknesses, and I suppose it's not really helpful to be super judgmental about people, because, you know, they're all pretty much operating the best way they possibly can. So, you know, in their world, so who am I to be scathing in my judgment of other people? It could equally be the same about me, but, you know, we're all the consequence, or the kind of the build-up of the product of all those complexities and differences, and we just have different worldviews. So it does make it difficult, really, doesn't it, to how do you rebuild the trust with people? So that's me talking about different friendships. So I've talked about the pandemic, I've talked about politics, I've talked about friendship, and talked about the erosion of trust. I suppose the last thing I should really mention is the media. Now, the media world's changed hugely in the last few years. You know, we all, in the UK, we grew up with the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Sky News, and they were, and of course the newspapers as well, long established newspapers. And it's kind of all we were told, really. And people talk about the mainstream media, but I don't think it's the mainstream media. It's kind of the legacy media. It's the kind of the hangover from the time when there were very limited avenues in which to kind of understand the world outside your own personal experience, or the news was being filtered for you and presented in ways that, you know, kind of made sense, and that's kind of how we formed our views on all the events, all the issues of the day, and the politics and so on. But now you've got, you know, with the internet now, I'm loath to say it's completely mature, because I think it's always changing, but you've also got the media platforms and many other new media outlets using social media and the likes of YouTube to bring news and analysis to people. It's much harder. Yeah, it's okay.
Hello.
Hiya, you alright?
I am.
Ali, Ali, Ali!
Yeah. First time out.
Nice bike. So yeah, we now have this you know, massive range of outlets for news and analysis that we could have only dreamed about years ago. And what a difference the last couple of years has made, because if you've been following the kind of the main events of the last couple of years, you will know that what's being presented on the legacy media, just fastening my boots here because they've been giving me blisters, I think, what's being broadcast and communicated via the legacy media, oh, it's been so different from what's been available elsewhere. And that's even when both kind of new media and legacy media have been using the same sources of official information. So for one example, one example is when you have a pandemic and you've got a new illness around, well, it creates what we call statistically excess deaths, so deaths above the average of, I think people normally talk about, the statisticians normally talk about the average over the preceding 5 years. And so when you have people getting a new illness, people die. And you'd expect excess deaths, and they were excess deaths in 2020 and 2021. But what's really interesting is that 2 years on, when everyone's had the medical procedure, or just about everyone, excess deaths are still existing. So you'd expect, really, when you have excess deaths with a new illness, is that it kind of finishes off people who are vulnerable, maybe almost at the end of their lives anyway, and so you'd expect the year or two, the following years, to have reduced excess deaths or even no excess deaths above the average. But we're still getting excess deaths in the UK, and it's happening elsewhere. So for example, in Europe, the official, I think, Eurostat statistics says that on average across European nations, and that might be European Union nations, is that excess deaths are running at 16% above the average, and higher than that, over 20% in Spain, Italy and France, I believe. The media is not reporting that. They were doing daily briefings and news reports in 2020 and 2021 about the number of people who died, but there's barely a whisper about the excess deaths that are continuing right now. So that begs a very, very important question, is how much can you trust media? I mean, we know you can't trust media from the internet, and you can't trust all sources from YouTube, of course. You'd be a fool to do so, but you also can't trust the legacy media. So that's a breakdown in trust as well. So that's probably enough of me waxing lyrical about why I don't trust anybody. Don't trust the government, don't trust the media, don't trust some of my friends, barely trust myself. 2.5 years, almost 3 years into, well, since we had the pandemic, which has kind of been declared as over, but it's not over till the fat lady sings, eh? So we'll have to wait and see. But anyway, that's me having a bit of a wander and a bit of a chat about where I feel we are in 2022, November 2022. And so I'll see you on the next video. That's if you bother to come back. Thanks for watching anyway. See you later.